friends, it's a bit unusual to have a law that actually promotes the Second Amendment and the freedom of people to keep and bear arms. It's a little bit unusual to have that called unconstitutional, but a federal judge did that in the state of Missouri. Before we get into that, please visit my friends over at CMMG for some of the finest firearms on the planet. Use my code FTATF to receive 10% off store-wide on their website. U.S. District Judge Brian C. Wimes, an Obama appointee, naturally, ruled that Missouri's Second Amendment Preservation Act is unconstitutional. That is, of course, their Second Amendment sanctuary city law that they had in place. The law sought to prevent state officials from cooperating with federal officials to enforce certain federal gun laws. The judge stated that while purporting to protect citizens, the law exposed citizens to greater harm by interfering with the federal government's ability to enforce lawfully enacted firearms regulations designed by Congress, not designed by Congress, designed by the ATF, for the purpose of, quote, protecting citizens within the limits of the Constitution. Interesting to hear a federal judge, whose job it is to interpret the Constitution in his rulings, to actually say that a law that's put in place specifically to protect a constitutional right is unconstitutional. Missouri's law, which featured stiff penalties for law enforcement officials who failed to comply, was one of the most expansive examples of a sanctuary-style law when it was signed by Governor Mike Parson in 2021. The law stipulated that, quote, all federal acts, laws, executive orders, administrative orders, court orders, rules, and regulations, whether past, present, or future, that infringe on the people's right to keep and bear arms as guaranteed by the Second Amendment must be invalid in this state. Now let me read part of that line to you guys one more time. He's talking about any laws that infringe. Remember, the Constitution says shall not be infringed. So they're just using the word of the Constitution when they say any law that would infringe on the people's right to keep and bear arms, all words taken from the Second Amendment, as guaranteed by the Second Amendment, must be invalid in the state. So they're saying literally, word for word, using the terminology of the Constitution, that if the federal government tries to pass a law in our state that violates people's constitutional rights, it will be invalid. I don't understand this judge thinking that that simple wording makes it unconstitutional. It literally supports the Constitution. It's not possible for it to be unconstitutional. It might be, according to the federal judge, un-American by his standards because he thinks that any ruling coming down from Washington, D.C. somehow or another is American, but it's certainly not unconstitutional. The Missouri Sanctuary City Law offered a broad definition of potential infringements, including any gun tax not applied to all goods or services if it could reasonably create a chilling effect on gun purchases, any gun registration, any sales ban or confiscation effort that affects law-abiding citizens, which the act defined as anyone not prohibited from owning guns under Missouri law. All things well within the Constitution, and certainly well within the wording of the Second Amendment. This Reload article went on to say that that definition seemed to encompass parts of several federal gun laws already on the books, such as the National Firearms Act and Gun Control Act. Additionally, this law created a $50,000 civil penalty for any state or local officials who tried to enforce or assist in enforcing any law declared invalid by the state. It also allowed the penalty to be enforced through suits brought by private individuals. Now, the Biden administration was not having this. We know that their anti-gun goals are pretty obvious to everybody. They tried to support a lawsuit against this act, and they failed. So the DOJ and Merrick Garland filed their own federal lawsuit against the state of Missouri. Garland argued that the law interfered with the ability of law enforcement to prevent violent crime. How do you prevent violent crime? How do you prevent that? If you can't predict it, how do you prevent it? Unless you went poof and made every single gun disappear, there's no way to eliminate gun deaths. Criminals are going to criminal, right? So how in the world does anybody use this stupid terminology of preventing deaths, preventing violent crime? That is not possible. You can only manage it. And if you want to manage the people who are committing these crimes, what's the best way to do it? If I had two options, one of them was to try to manage the criminals or manage an inanimate object, a gun, which one makes the most sense and which is the only one that actually has any real impact on the outcome of any perceived future crime that has not happened yet? Oddly enough, guess who weighed in on it? Yeah, this is a victory lap for the Giffords Law Firm. These are these opportunistic people who came out. Actually, believe it or not, the Giffords Law Firm, whatever they call themselves, the anti-gun group, they came out in support of this smackdown of this Missouri law. They stated that in a victory for, quote, common sense, misused word right there, a federal court declared Missouri's Second Amendment Preservation Act unconstitutional. These so-called Second Amendment sanctuaries are an affront to the Constitution they pretend to protect. Other states should take note. This is a veiled threat at other states who may be looking to do something like this. My advice to you guys in other states, keep doing what you're doing because this is going to go down. I find it very ironic, funny, and sickening that this organization would say these so-called Second Amendment sanctuaries are an affront to the Constitution they pretend to protect. They don't pretend to protect. Just like I read in this particular law in Missouri, there's no hidden wording in there. Whenever these people put out these anti-gun laws, there's always hidden wording. There's ambiguous meanings in there. There's a lot of loopholes and craters where people could fall into and get themselves into trouble. But when you put out a law that says you cannot pass a law that infringes upon my Second Amendment rights, that's about as clear as it gets. We don't have to create ambiguity in these laws because it's easy to do the right thing. You have to create snares and traps and things like that in order to get people tricked in to going to jail whenever you're trying to do something that's unconstitutional. When you're trying to do the right thing, you don't have to create that ambiguity that they have to create. That's why when these people talk out like this, they're exposing themselves. This is a very constitutional law that I think something else is going to happen in the very near future. It's just a shame that we have this type of setback right now. But this ain't the end of it.
I'm sorry, I thought this was America.